Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Spencer Cronin. I am JCRC's Director of Educational Partnerships, and I am very excited for our guest on the podcast today for a number of reasons. But in the work that we do at JCRC in cultivating welcoming, safe, and inclusive communities for Jewish students alongside all students, the idea of the online world comes up a lot. All of the conversations that I have with schools are in some way, shape, or form get around to, there's only so much we can do. We try everything that we can and we put all these things in place, and then we have no control over what happens when they go home or when they get on their phones. And so to that end, I'm very excited to have Dr. Jill Walsh joining us today. Dr. Jill Walsh is a sociology lecturer and researcher at Boston University. She's also the founder of Digital Aged, a consulting group that educates students, families, and educational institutions about positive technology use. She earned a PhD in sociology from Boston University, a master's in public policy from Brown University, and a BA from Harvard University. So New England through and through.
Yes, very much.
Before graduate school, she taught 9th through 12th grades at an independent school. Her research looks at the ways that digital media use impacts psychosocial well-being and development. Her book, Adolescents and Their Social Media Narratives, A Digital Coming of Age, was published in 2017. Her research interests include social media and identity work, parasocial relationships, mental health, and digital hate speech. And she works with schools throughout the country to develop best practices and policies around technology and social media use. So the absolute perfect person to have with us to talk about this. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So I think to start, can you tell me a little bit about how you became interested in the digital world and specifically how young people, teens, engage with it?
Yeah. Okay. The very short version is I've always been interested in teenagers' social networks, and I used to study in-person social networks. That was what I was doing when I got my master's. And in particular, what I've always been interested in is how social networks are either protective or potentially dangerous for health, health broadly defined, so physical and mental health. And as I was doing that work and starting to think about my PhD, Facebook emerged, and, I started to think about it, and I was looking at it, I'm like, this is a really interesting version of a social network. And so that's what sort of pivoted me into looking at social media in particular. But it's always been rooted in this idea of how is it protective? How does it help kids? How are they using it to access both the broader world and then also to think about their own identity and aspects of that they want to explore, and how that impacts physical health and mental health.
Awesome. Yeah. Did you get mad when they stole the movie title, The Social Network?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's a really good title.
Exactly. So we use this phrase, the digital world, a fair amount. But I want to talk a little bit, or have you talk a little bit about what actually constitutes the digital space. I know for many people, especially parents and families, some of whom are probably watching this, it can feel like the platforms that young people are using to engage with each other are changing and evolving faster than we can keep up. So can you give us just like a snapshot of the ways in which young people are accessing the online world and engaging with each other?
Yeah, sure. And I appreciate that preface, Spencer, because it's like June 2026. And if we record this in 3 months, I might be like, oh, whoops, we're talking about totally different things. So yes, how are they accessing digital spaces? Through every possible device they have. I mean, you could literally talk about a smart TV as a way to access digital platforms, right? Because you can watch YouTube on that, you can play video games and talk to each other. So really anything right now constitutes the digital space, which makes it sort of an amorphous term, but it's helpful in two ways. I think about it as certainly all the social media platforms, as well as gaming. I think about it as any place where kids are either connecting with other people or perhaps exploring aspects of the world that might not be accessible to them in their day-to-day lives. And so that is certainly gaming, that's social media, that's AI now, right? It's even Netflix and streaming services, right? Everything sort of constitutes digital space. And so that's why I'd say it's kind of all encompassing. But they are really accessing it. I think the important thing for families and educators to understand is that kids are really accessing this all day long. If they have access to a device, they have access to digital spaces and they're utilizing it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that distinction between the ways they're interacting with each other versus the ways they're interacting with the broader world that would be otherwise unavailable. Because I think we talk a lot about, and we'll get to this, the ways the challenges that come with students interacting with each other directly online. But like you could take that away. Like you could, and I'm sure there's ways to do this, but like you could ban your, young person's device from having actual direct contact from people, comments, messages, texts, whatever it is. And you would still be left with a whole host of the internet world that is shaping so much of our young people's lives.
Correct. Yeah. And I think that's a really important point. And so what I'm really interested in the ways that those two spaces interact, right? Sometimes the broader digital world and influencers and content creators, they're sort of amplifying something in the culture that then moves into the friend and peer interactions and gets, in some cases literally mimicked, in other cases refracted in interesting ways. And then that's feeding up to the culture. And so it's this really interesting symbiotic relationship between the two.
Yeah, really, really interesting. So before we get to the negative, because I know we are going to spend a fair amount of time, most of our time talking about that together, I do want to give you some space to talk about the positives of the online world. How can the digital world help foster a sense of belonging for young people?
Yeah. And I think it's really important because it's actually, well, first of all, just so everybody knows, I mean, I'm not insane, right? I wouldn't study this for 20 years if I thought it was all awful, right? If every day I went to work and I was like, oh, here's another reason why we hate it. I really do think there's tremendously positive things there, and they deserve recognition, both in terms of like, I think we should just understand it, but also in terms of how we engage with kids, right? Because if we don't acknowledge the positive, I think we then, when we hyperfixate on the negative, we kind of lose them, right? And so I think it's about holding both together as saying, yeah, there's some crummy stuff and we're going to talk about that and we need to be prepared, but also I see the value in this, right? And I think kids, especially middle schoolers and high schoolers, are really open to those kinds of conversations. So I do think acknowledging positive and being aware of it is really important. So to get into it, there's a couple of key things that I get really excited about. First of all, digital spaces, particularly social media, are spaces where people can speak truth to power. And that's a very cliche phrase that gets very overused, and yet it is absolutely the case. Like the reason we know about so many things that are happening in the world, which can be a negative, right? We'll talk about that later. But the reason we know about that is because there's somebody somewhere in the United States or somewhere in the world that takes a video and posts it and says, this is what you should know is happening, right? Now, I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying there isn't, cases where that goes wrong. But the idea of being able to challenge the traditional power hierarchies is really important, right? Think about movements like the Arab Spring, Me Too, right? So many things that have come out of digital spaces to start are really important in that way. And then certainly the opportunity to amplify existing movements like Black Lives Matter, which existed certainly before digital engagement. But when it moved to the digital space, it became more visible, something that people could connect around. So the broader question of power that digital technology allows us to challenge, I think is really exciting. Now, in the wrong hands, that can go wrong, but overall, it excites me. The other thing in terms of teenagers and identity that I find really exciting is the ways that kids can find genuine belonging and connection in digital spaces. And I know this makes a lot of adults uncomfortable, right? It doesn't look like sort of traditional ideas of connection or community, but they are genuine and they are real. And, I hear it certainly in kids that I interview who will say to me, it could be about aspects of their identity. It could be things that they're just interested in. And that they'll say to me, like, no one at school is interested in the same thing I'm interested in. And I go online and there's all these people who are as involved in whatever, like sea turtle habitats as I am, and they care, right? And so you can feel that connection. But certainly the data we know, and the one that I'm particularly excited about is research on transgender and non-binary youth. This is a study that came out from Cronin and a couple of other scholars in 2024 that looked at social media use for trans and non-binary teens. And it's really fascinating because I read the abstract and I was like, really? This can't be true. It said that basically, most teens should use less social media with the exception of trans and non-binary youth.
Interesting.
Right. And I was like, how could this be? As the topic of what we're doing today, like there's so much hate. There's so much negative content out there. How could we be encouraging this group of kids who really don't have privilege in the digital world? How could they benefit from this? And what the researchers found was that because of that lack of privilege, and that's a really important point to navigate because it's true of a variety of different marginalized groups. But because of the lack of privilege they experience, they actually have to work incredibly hard to curate positive spaces. And they do that. And they actually find support, community, and engagement in digital spaces because they have to work. So I'm really excited about the finding. I don't think we should go, oh, isn't this great, right? We should acknowledge the fact that it's coming because there is so much hate. Maybe another teen might be able to just blindly follow whatever their friends are doing, right? They have to be more circumspect in what they're doing, and that comes from a negative, right? But the consequence is that they're designing these spaces that are really working for them. And we're seeing this in other populations. So like kids of color in predominantly white institutions, they do well with being able to access social media during the day and seeing other kids going through similar things, right? So there's this really interesting way that it can affirm identity. It can help you feel like you're not alone, which, is a classic teenage experience anyway, right? Regardless of who you are. And so I think those positives, as well as the more grand macro, like, challenging power hierarchies, they're both important.
Yeah, that interconnectedness, I think, is so important. And I really, I appreciate what you said at the very, very beginning of, we have to acknowledge the positive if we are going to reach young people on this. We know that, young people tune out 90% of what adults say to them anyway. And if we're coming to them with just, this is terrible, I can't believe you spend 12 hours a day on your phone, blah, 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 like they're going to tune it off because you're not acknowledging what they see in it, right? Obviously they see value in it. Otherwise they wouldn't be spending 12 hours a day on their phone. And so to not lead with that, or at least acknowledge that, is we've completely lost them. I think I don't even know where I heard this, but the smartest thing I ever heard, I think, about the internet is, like every new technological invention we've ever had in all of time, it makes good things better and bad things worse.
That's right.
So with that in mind, let's get to the bad. So, there's a myriad of ways that this all-consuming nature of the internet and the online world is harming. We'll stick with young people because that's sort of the focus of our conversation. So can you just give us like a 30,000 foot like state of the union on this? Yeah.
And there's a couple, we could talk for a whole hour on this. So I'll touch on a couple things that I think are probably most important. And one of them is this theory I love, which is called displacement theory, right? And it's the idea of, what are you not doing because you're using your phone, right? And so if you're doing, if you're not doing something like, I don't know, doing drugs, right? Okay, well, that's a good thing, right? Then we would think that's a good displacement. The challenge with digital devices is that they often take us away from things that are actually really good for us, right? So things like sleep. So we know kids are using their devices way too much late at night. That's impacting sleep, and sleep is probably the most important lever young people can pull for their mental health, right? If like, my mentor, and I think just a great advocate for teen mental health, Lisa D'Amour, she always says, like, the first thing I want to address is sleep before I will even think about anything else going on with the teenager. And I think that's right. So one of the critical things for families to think about is that late night use. So that's one aspect of displacement. The other aspect of displacement that's important is the social component, right? So I talked about how we can create community and connection digitally, but also what we are seeing, I go to a lot of schools where kids in the cafeteria are all looking at their phones and they're not talking to each other. And, that does worry me. I don't have the moral panic of like, oh, they can't, they'll never be able to engage. I don't think that's right. But I do think they're missing. I think a cafeteria should be loud and boisterous and, there should be some chaos. And I'm not hearing that when I'm going into most high schools. So that worries me. And then the third piece of displacement, which is concerning for young people, is just, and I don't mean this like it has to be a team sport or anything like that, but just like moving our bodies, right? Like we're just not doing enough of that as young people because this thing is so appealing. And why would I take a walk when I can do this? But the other interesting thing connected to that is even when kids are maybe taking a walk or getting some, they still have, earbuds in, they're listening to content, they're taking in, they're consuming. And so one of the things probably that alarms me the most is that they're not alone with their thoughts, right? They're just constantly distracted. And that's true of adults too. But I would say the pivotal sort of developmental period that teens are in, it makes me worried. So that's sort of one lens that concerns me. The other is the one that you used just a minute ago, which is what I would call like the law of amplification, right? The idea that digital spaces amplify what's happening in our society. And that could certainly be good, but it is often for the negative, right? And so what gets amplified is important for us to think about. So I think there's a couple of lenses to consider there. The first is, the algorithm, which is going to send us to this, like, you watched it, now watch more of it, right? So if you are in that place where something negative is getting amplified, it's all you're going to see. Yep. Certainly one of the things we know that gets amplified over and over again is disinformation, which I know we'll talk about more. The important thing I want to say up front about disinformation is we get hyper fixated on like, evil trolls and the internet or bots that are doing this. And they are absolutely out there. But the greatest source of disinformation is actually our peers. And so I think it's important to keep that also at the kid-to-kid level and the social level. So that certainly concerns me. A lot of disinformation too, in addition to news and politics and things like that, but a lot of disinformation about mental health, which worries me a lot. There's a lot of content creators that are talking about like 4 signs you have depression. And these are not people who are qualified to speak on that topic. And then, of course, the last topic, which concerns me, which always has, is the cruelty that we can see, right? That, and that fills the gamut of, harassment, explicit content, bullying, hate speech, all fits in there. I would say, having done this for a lot of years, when I look at the average teen group text, it is significantly crueler than it was 10 years ago. The comments that are just coming out, they seem to, from my perspective, sort of come out of nowhere. And they're very harsh, and they're very targeted. And that does feel different.
Yeah.
In important ways.
I think, again, going back to that divide, which like is only sort of really crystallizing in my mind over the last like 30 minutes of our conversation between like the ways that they're engaging directly with each other and then the ways that they're engaging with the broader world.
That's right.
This idea of like the group chat has become, in, I don't know how many, the last decade or so, like you said, the like driving way that young people interact with each other.
Yep.
And I, in the conversations that I've had with young people, which like are nowhere near as extensive or clinical and, whatever is the ones that you have, but like they're talking about, oh, there's different types of group chats and people get left out and people said this to this thing, like, and how it's so much of, and I think, I'm not sure how much people understand this at like a psychological level, like it has become at least 50%, if not more, of the way that they engage with each other in a way that I think, especially for older generations, like even myself who didn't have that growing up, like I'm not sure we can fully wrap our heads around what exactly that means, right? That means that literally the things they are saying to each other are in text snippets, are, taken without tone, are taken without body language. Like, could you talk a little bit more about that before we get to like the other side of it? Because I think that is so important.
Yeah. And it is. And kids run the gamut on the group chat, right? Some kids are like, let's go. I love it. It's, I pick up my phone, I have 87 notifications and that's awesome. And other kids pick that up and they see 87 notifications and they're like, how in the world am I going to navigate this? I have to, my favorite is talking to middle schoolers that are like, I have to respond to everything. I have to say something different from what was already said, right? So I have to figure out a different way to be like awesome without saying awesome because everybody said that. I have to send something funny. I have to be witty. I have to like perhaps one up, right? So if somebody made a joke, now I have to make a bigger joke, right? And it can feel, and I know that can happen offline, but the pressure's really quite ramped up when it's coming at you that fast, right? When you're picking up your phone and you're seeing all those notifications and you're feeling like you got to weigh in right now, that does feel different. Add to it what you said, like there's no tone, there's no context. Like, how do you read sarcasm? How do I know how things are supposed to be meant? If you catch me on one day, I might think, oh, that was pretty funny. You made fun of me, but it was, I get it. I'm in on the joke. You catch me the next day, that could like literally hit me right at my core and exactly what, and then it feels like what a lot of kids, they don't use this language, but how I would frame it is it's like meanness in public. And that in the group chat, if you make fun of me, it feels to them like everyone has seen that. Now, that would certainly be true if you made fun of me at school and, whatever. But there's so many other things going on at school and people are half listening and whatever. But in the group chat, it's like everyone can see the thread of what you said, how I responded, did anyone else respond? And that feels very high stakes for a lot of kids.
It's there permanently, right?
Yes.
Like if I say something to you in a hallway, like it's there and it's out and
That's
it's
right.
reverberations, but like if it's written down, it is there forever. And, you know, building off of what you said before about like it's so constructed. It almost feels like the pressure to be perfect. It almost feels scripted. Like it almost feels like
performative.
They are writing themselves as characters in a TV show, right? Where like everything that I say has to be perfectly scripted and performed, like you had said. And I think that, so I think this is a good sort of segue into the next part of what I wanted to talk about, which is the rise of this identity-based targeting that has become so common in this day and age. And I kind of want to set the stage for that because I think a lot, we talk a lot about like online hate, harassment, like what does this mean? You know, we know that we are seeing by any metric you want to use a rise in identity-based targeting of all shapes and kinds across age demographics, across every section of the United States. And there are, you know, these sort of particular problems related to these different systems of oppression that we're seeing. There's obviously a tremendous rise in anti-Semitism as a distinct form of hate, like all of these different, but then there's also the Venn diagram part, and especially with young people, the just erosion of culture that you're talking about where, and we can talk about COVID in a second because I think that plays a huge part in it, but the overall just like alphabet soup of young people saying and doing horrible things to and about each other. And a lot of times those things are identity based, but not always, right? It could be, I don't know, like outfit based. Like I am roasting this backpack that somebody bought and I'm like, somebody's going to be crying at home that night because the entire group chat like went off making fun of her backpack, you know. But a lot of it is identity based, right? And so how do we, make sense of that? What are, your takeaways that you have about this? What are the teens saying when you're having conversations with them? What is your take on all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's so important. And it's probably the one that I think, unless your child has been the target of this, you might not actually realize how bad it is. And I, do you know what I mean? And I say that again, going back to my years of doing this, I would never say, oh, I never saw anything. I absolutely saw, slurs being used and things like that. But it has definitely ramped up significantly in the last, I would say, 6 years. And what's really fascinating to me is how often it's said with no consequence. So, let's say 8 years ago, I might have seen someone use an F slur in a group chat, but someone might have said like, hey, like, don't say that. Or what are you doing? Like some version of that, or done the pivot or, some sort of like used humor to deflect, but it would have sort of been taken on. What's fascinating to me now is when kids show me in a group chat that somebody used some sort of identity-based slur or, we'll talk about humor because I think that's a really important component of this. No one in the group chat is calling that out. Right. So it's often left to the person who's being targeted to police. And that just, so of course we know this, but it's worth saying, that is so emotionally taxing for a child to be navigating because you're taking on certainly the hate that you're experiencing and you're trying to navigate that. You're also then dealing with the social dynamics of this group chat, right? If I take on this group chat, I might be tossed from the group chat. And that might sound to you and me, we might be like, well, thank God, right? I want you to be tossed from the group chat where they're targeting you. The challenge for kids, and I think it's important for adults to understand this because it's more rational than it might seem on the surface. If you get dropped from a group chat, there's actually no guarantee you get picked up by another group chat. And to what you said earlier, that is the way they're communicating. That's where they're setting plans. That's where the like early release day, like where are we going? And it might even be a walk to CVS, but it matters when you're in 9th grade and you get dropped from that and now you're out of all of it. So the stakes to call it out are really high. So I think that's important to name. I think there's a couple, and then the other thing I want to name at the outset is, this study, which I think, hopefully is quite shocking, but also then I think if we think about the context of right now, it might make sense. But UCLA did some research. It's called their SMASH study in 2024. And they found that in the span of a month, 80% of American youth were being exposed to some type of hate speech. And it was on digital technology. And it was predominantly based on race, gender, and religion. And I think it's just worth noting that because it's 80% of kids who are being exposed to this. I would add in the last couple of years, a lot of appearance-based hate, particularly comments about body size have become very, very prominent in kid language. And these things are deeply hurtful. So where's it coming from, right? Is kind of the thing. I think you're right, keeping that juxtaposition. So one of them I would say at the platform level is the way these algorithms are designed, right? So two features of them that I think are worth mentioning. One I already touched on is the idea that once you watch it, they're like, great, you loved it, here we go. And that is all they care about. And I think making sure adults are saying to kids, they don't care, that what you're seeing is helping you. They don't care if it's making you feel good about yourself. They just care that you're watching. Yeah. And things that shock us, things that offend us and upset us are things that tend to keep our eyeballs on their content, right? It's just unfortunately the way they've been able to manipulate human psychology. And so we're getting exposed to a lot of it. That's important because of this really interesting concept in social psychology called the mere exposure effect, which gets at the idea that the more we're exposed to things, it's not like I watch one anti-Semitic post and I think, oh, now I'm suddenly, anti-Semitic. It's not that. But it is the idea that if over time I'm exposed to, let's say, more anti-Semitic content, it starts to become normalized for me, right? And I might not say it, but I'm, when I see it out in the world, how it can work in kids' minds is they'll say things like, well, some people think that, right? You become comfortable with ideas that, I would argue should be abhorrent, right? So that exposure to content, and a lot of kids will say to me like, what's the big deal? I just watched a video. Like, honestly, lady, who cares, right? And I'm like, no, actually, we do care because the more you're exposed to these ideas, at the beginning, they're very shocking. At the beginning, you're like, what am I watching? Over time, you just start to normalize them. So that's one thing the algorithm is doing. And then the other thing that I think is really, really fascinating, and this is research out of Dublin City University. I think it was 2025, but they did a study where they looked at TikTok and they created, sort of fake, puppet accounts, they call them, and they just made them male identifying. And we can, quibble with that. They sort of played around with things they thought a teenage boy would be interested in. So it was, workout things, sports things. Again, we could quibble, but for the sake of this, it's pretty interesting. And all they did after sort of like indicating a couple of things based on things they watched, they then just watched whatever TikTok sent them. So they didn't, after that initial, like, once you get me, I'm going to step back. Every account they created, they played around with age. They played around with what specific identifiers they gave it. Every account within the first 23 minutes got exposed to some type of misogynistic content. 23 minutes. Correct. Now, if we think about it, the average teen, to your point, is on these platforms for hours a day. Now, here's what's really interesting. If you watched it, so whatever you got exposed to, it's almost like TikTok is testing you, right? It's like, hey, see what you think. If you watched it, even if in your mind you were like, oh my gosh, this is so bad, I can't believe I'm watching this. If you watched it, within the next 2 to 3 hours, you got sent more extreme, more hate-filled content. And it starts to, over the course of the span of literally hours, move you into extreme alt-right content that moves into, xenophobic content, homophobic, transphobic, anti-Semitic. It is literally covering the gamut. And it's coming from that first initial watch, right? And you can imagine the average 13-year-old who's scrolling through, right? It's not that deep. I'm taking a break from my math homework, right? You stumble across this thing and you think like, oh, whoa, what are they doing? You've watched it, and now we're in that mere exposure effect. So now you're getting more normalized into that content. So that's what's happening at the algorithm level or the platform level, and I think that's important to mention. The other thing is what's happening at the peer level, and I would argue cultural level too, which is this idea of humor. This humor is, we could argue probably has always been terribly confusing, right? And who gets to use identity humor and how that gets used. But it's very, very confusing to teens right now. And a lot of particularly middle schoolers, right, who really want that black or white thinking of like, is this okay? Is it not? Will say to me like, what's the line, right? I want to know the line because so much of humor right now is identity based. And kids are really confused about, is this okay? Is this not? What's the line? How do I know something went from like something I could joke about to something I can't? And this is literally a conversation from this spring that I had in a focus group where kids were talking about in a group chat, as we were discussing, one of the Asian American kids included a meme that was sort of making fun of Asian stereotypes around grades and parents caring deeply about grades. And a white kid said, so I'm in the group chat. I get this. Can I like this? Can I write a comment? Or is it just that person who can do it? Right. And that's actually a really interesting and important conversation. No one's having it with them. Or that was hyperbolic, but a lot of people, they're generally speaking, kids aren't having those conversations and they really want to. They don't get it. They don't understand. We don't have, right, at the societal level, great models of this. So they're not seeing it play out in ways that discussion can happen in productive ways. And I think they're really craving it. And so I think the notion of like, what's funny is really what I'm seeing a lot of is what a phenomenal 8th grade boy referred to me as mean funny. Like a lot of funny right now is mean, and mean in all of its forms, but a lot of it can be targeted at individuals. So that was a very long-winded answer.
No, I think that just is like so fascinating and so important. And I was writing some stuff down, trying to sort of figure out how I was going to synthesize this. Yeah. And for me, what I think this really hits on is that, and tell me if I'm off base here, I don't even know what the word I'm looking for. The social universe of normal, whatever normal is, has shifted for young people.
Totally.
And the rest of the world of, above the generation of young people either doesn't quite realize it or doesn't want to face it because of the consequences for just how far we have deviated from normal.
Yeah.
And I think the other big piece of that I think really explains a lot of why so many young people are hesitant to push back against this is who wants to push back from normal?
Right.
Who wants to be called out for saying something isn't funny or something offended you if that thing is normal?
Yeah.
Like if we're dealing with like what I consider adult normal or something, I don't even know what would pass for some sort of comment about adult normal. You're like, hey, those glasses are a little big for your eyes. Yeah. If you freaked out and are like, that was incredibly offensive to me. Like, I can't believe you said that. This was so not okay. We need to like making a big deal about whatever has social consequences for you because you are calling out something that's seen as normal.
Yeah.
And so like that to me is, I think we're not facing the state of the problem because we haven't even recognized the state of the problem for what it is.
That's right. And I would add to that, what I hear from adults so often when I raise this topic is they're like, I know it's really important. I don't know what to say. Right. Because, they'll say, well, I don't know. Like, you can imagine, like, I'm an English teacher. That discussion of the group chat comes up. Am I the one that's going to weigh in and say, no, you can't say this as a white kid, but you can say this? Right. Is that right? Like that feels very heavy. And a lot of people feel like I'm not qualified to answer it.
Yes.
And I get that. I totally do. What I think is really interesting is I often don't answer it either. I just put it out to the group and I'm like, great question. What do you all think? Right. And that's where I think it's really interesting because then I get to hear, now obviously I'm playing a different role in that case, but it's really interesting to hear because someone will say, I don't think you can say that. And here's why. And another kid might be like, well, it depends on the friend group and how different, right? And like, but you're starting to get the nuance of how they're thinking. And I actually think those are the conversations kids want to have. Yes, there's definitely kids that want to know, like, I can't say X, Y, and Z, right? Of course. But I think for the most part, they really want to discuss the nuances. And like, this is a very benign example, but I talk often with like 5th and 6th graders about this. Like some friend groups will use the word weird in a very positive way, right? They will call each other weird. They think of it as a term of endearment. It's great. Other friend groups, if you said you're so weird after somebody posted something, they'd be like, oh my God, right? And so even thinking through that, right? How do you know where you are? And I think those are conversations they want to have. And so I think adults feel like I have to be fully educated and know exactly the appropriate answer to give before I engage them. And I feel like that's where we're doing them such a disservice, where they actually just want to talk about it. And when we are like, oh, I don't know, we shut down the conversation before it even gets started.
Yeah. And so, these young people are negotiating the boundaries of what is socially acceptable. They're looking to adults for guidance around it, and they're not getting it. And now what I think, this to some degree, and you're the sociologist, not me. So again, tell me if I'm wrong. This has happened throughout history, right? Yes. Young people have negotiated boundaries of what is socially acceptable, part of adolescent development, human development, all of these things.
Yes.
To me, what I think is different in this day and age is exactly what we talked about earlier on in the conversation, is that there has never been a bigger gulf between the social worlds of young people and the social worlds of adults.
Yeah.
Right? Adults today have never grown up in the social world. There's never been a bigger divide between the social world that adults grew up in and young people grew up in. And so when they're looking for that guidance, it's almost like they're speaking different languages.
Totally. And, what's really interesting to me is I often give this example when I'm talking to parents and guardians is a kid might come in and let's say they've experienced some type of hate. And let's just, for sake of example, it happens on Snapchat, right? Yep. So it happens in a chat on Snap. And so the parent hears this happened on Snapchat. And all the parent is doing is being like, which one is Snapchat? Do I hate Snapchat? Do I like Snapchat? Right. And we're getting hyper fixated on the problem of Snapchat, which, don't get me wrong, that's an important conversation. But the kid in that moment wants to talk about the experience they had. And so I think because it's happening in these things that feel somewhat alien to us, because you're right. Even if we're using it, it's different, right? If I'm looking at TikTok as a grown adult, where I'm not figuring out who I am and I have, relatively speaking, a sense of self that's fairly secure, even me watching TikTok isn't going to be the same as if I was 13, right? So you can have familiarity with all these things, but you're not experiencing it, right, in the same way. And so because these things feel so alien to us, we get hyperfixated on what we don't know and then don't engage. And I actually sometimes think the conversation they want to have is like, what do you do when somebody says something really hurtful to you? And I never had that happen to me on Snapchat, but I've certainly had it happen to me in my life, right? And so thinking about how can we engage with them on that level first and then move into the conversation of okay, what do we do now that we know this happened digitally? Right. I think that would be a great first step, because I actually think families, although they don't maybe understand all the nuances of the digital stuff, they do get a lot of the experiences that kids are having. And they're just turned off to the conversation because they worry they can't offer insight.
Yeah. And let's multiply that times a factor of whatever when schools are involved, where you're being asked to police things among students, all of those same things. And I'm not your parent. I'm your teacher. I don't know the extent to which my authority extends.
Yeah.
Am I allowed to make you show me your Instagram account? Am I allowed to make you unlock your phone and show me what's on Snapchat? This is being litigated at court levels right now. There are no answers for this. I'm going to draw an interesting parallel that all of that just made me think of to tie back to JCRC's work a little bit around, we support schools in combating antisemitism, cultivating welcoming, safe and inclusive spaces for Jewish students. And a lot of time what I see in our work is, and I hear this a lot from schools, or I shouldn't say that. When I say this a lot to schools, they go, oh yeah, that's right. You've put the nail on the head. As I say, it seems like there is such a hesitancy to address these issues because we live in such a polarizing moment, particularly around this topic, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's the conflict in the Middle East, however you want to sort of broaden that circle. They are so hestant to put a foot wrong in these conversations that they don't put any foot forward at all.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. 1,000% agree with you. Yes, at the adult level, and that's also true at the peer-to-peer level, which really leaves kids feeling like, could somebody just help me out with this, right? So yes, I'm right, and I have empathy for adults. It's happened to me in my classroom where we're not even talking about anything connected to the topic, and someone will throw something out, and I'm like, okay, we're in it now, and I wasn't prepared for that, and that wasn't where I was going, but here we are, right? And so it can be very hard as an educator. So I completely agree with that. I think we need greater direction. I think a lot of times this is falling to a ninth grade teacher or something like that. And, really that shouldn't be on that individual's, plate. It should be taken up at a higher level. But those people are kind of avoiding the responsibility as well. And so it's just kind of trickling down. And then at the kid to kid level, which, I'm really glad you said that. It made me think of something I definitely wanted to highlight, which is, a lot of times kids will say, someone will make a post about, it's something they care about, right? And it could be something going on in the Middle East. And that person is posting it with the intention of trying to support what they care about, right? So kids will say, even assuming best case scenario, and sometimes they'll say, but I actually, I'm spent time looking at this. I'm pretty engaged in this. I actually know that's factually incorrect, right? Like, so I'm not talking about like your belief versus mine. Like the thing you're putting out is factually incorrect. And I will ask them, so what do you do in that situation? And they're like, oh, nothing. Because if I say, hey, actually, that's a video from 2 years ago. And that actually didn't happen yesterday. And, here, let me show you the paper trail of how this thing, right? What they worry is like in the case of this specific example, I'm thinking of, the student said to me, well, they're just going to come back and say, oh, that's because you don't support, you support genocide, right? Like that's why you think that. And so they're like, there's no gain to me to actually call out disinformation when I see it. Right. And I think that's really important to name. So kids are also like, what am I supposed to do? I don't know how to do this. I don't want to be, just going along with you when you're saying things that are wrong. But I also then, am I going to be the person that's policing all of this? I don't really know what's right. So it's so layered. And I think as a result, it's exactly what you said, that everybody's just kind of walking around being like, please don't ask me to answer this question. And the result is then we're really doing a disservice to kids, because the people who are willing to say, here's what I think and here's what I'm doing, they're the influencers. They're the people that are going on to just go viral. And they are really sure of themselves and they are giving kids answers, and they might not be nuanced. They might not be correct. They might not be, morally, we might not be morally okay with the answers they're giving them, but they are assertive. And so I do understand from a kid perspective why they might be drawn there when the adults in their lives are all like, I don't know. And then they watch this 2-minute video and the person's like, see, here's what's happening.
It seems like nuance and confidence are like an inverse scales kind of thing.
Totally.
Like you lose all credibility when as the second you say, well, it's more complicated than that, or let's take a second to boil this down. And again, this has been happening for generations and generations and years. Look at any presidential debate in American history. Like it's, the more confident you sound, the better you look. But again, not necessarily at the adolescent level where all of this is happening against the backdrop of them literally becoming who they are going to be as people at a biological and psychological level.
That's right. And I would just add to that, not the amount, right? The amount of content that they're being bombarded with. I mean, they're going from cute dog video to their friends, sports highlights video to something that might literally be incredibly offensive hate speech, all in the span of 20 seconds as they're scrolling, right? This content is coming at them so fast. And that fundamentally does feel different. So when people say, the printing press, that created disinformation too. I'm like, yeah, it did. But
like 12% of people could read.
That's right. That's right. And the time at which it came to the point where everybody could read, everybody had access to it. We had a couple of other institutions and things in place. And again, I don't want to paint it with rose-colored glasses. Of course, there were problems. But I think thinking about it of the first of all, the rate to adoption, like how quickly people move to, let's say, a TikTok. Right? The amount of hours the average teen is spending there and the level at which they're being bombarded with this content, that sort of perfect storm does feel different. I think.
So we have spent a ton of time basically setting the stage that we're all incredibly screwed.
Yeah, that's right. It's a great time.
We've spun the web, we've dug the hole, whatever metaphor you want to use. We are in a cluster right now. Let's start to talk about how we navigate our way through this. I'm not even going to say out of it, but like, how do we work through it? And let's start with the school level, because that's, again, sort of going back to our work. What are some of the things, and you obviously do a lot of work with schools to support them in this. What are some of the things that schools can and should be thinking about as it relates to some of this stuff?
Yeah. So one, I would say at the broadest level is the idea of what we were talking about, of like being comfortable with those uncomfortable conversations and actually letting them happen. And, maybe giving that scenario of like, hey, somebody says something in a group chat. What are our options here? And actually opening it to kids, right? And I think we often, want to say, so if someone says this in a group chat and then you should say, that's really offensive. Don't say that, right? And I agree. That's our ideal scenario. But I do think we want to let kids explore a variety of ways they might be able to address that, right? Someone might say, okay, my tactic would be, I'm going to change the topic in the group chat, but then privately, I'm going to reach out to somebody, that's awesome to me. Right. So, but being open to just like, let's talk about it. Let's explore. We know these things are happening. And that gets me to one other thing I want to say, which is, I think we sometimes worry about this topic. Like if I tell them there's hate out there, they will go look for it, right? And so I shouldn't be the one to bring this up. Yep. No, we absolutely have to bring it up, and they've already been exposed to it, right? Back to our 80% number. Yep. So talking about it, they already know. They want us to just sit with the thing of like, what do we do in this scenario? So that's one at the broadest level. I think another thing schools could really do some work on is talking about influencers. I would say it was sort of the work I did with schools over this last academic year. And kids were clearly craving it. Like they, and it could be about different versions of it, but the fundamental question of like, what are these people selling? Right now, some of them are obviously selling, their products that they're pitching right on their videos, but they're all selling something, right, to keep you coming back. And some of them are selling, shock. Right. And some of them are selling like be a provocateur, right? Some of them are selling those ideas to kids. And I think getting kids to think through the lens of every single one of them is selling you something. And so let's look at some from the obvious, like here's the makeup brand that I'm selling, to like, here's someone that actually doesn't seem to be pitching something, but they have 7 million followers. What are they actually selling, right? That lens can be really helpful for kids, I think, for that. I think a couple other things, talking to them about that mere exposure effect, I think is really important. Kids really don't see, like they'll say to me, it's not that deep, right? I'm just relaxing. It's not that deep. I think giving them some sense of how these platforms have manipulated psychology, psychological facts, and embed them into the algorithms, I think is really important. And then the last thing I think is really important for schools to think about is there's a group of kids, and we didn't really talk about them, but they're relevant here, who are watching a lot of content that could be quite traumatic because they care so deeply about the topic, right? And so it's not hate speech, but they might be watching video after video of, somebody being kidnapped or a family's home, whatever it is, right? And they're watching that because they feel, and this is language high schoolers will use with me, is they'll say, well, I need to bear witness. Like, I need to know. And I understand where they're coming from. In a one-on-one interview, it's really fascinating to talk to kids about, like, it's an absolute privilege to look away. Right? Like I can sit here in Boston and be like, oh, don't look at that, right? That's upsetting to you. Don't look at that, right? And that's a very privileged position to take, right? So that's important to acknowledge. At the same time, repeated exposure to those videos, it does have an impact on our well-being, right? And so thinking about helping kids understand, like, how can we consume the news? How can we be involved in things we care about and not actually overconsume to the point where we're actually not able to actually take action steps, right? That we're so inundated, like kids feel so terrified and so upset and so sad about what's happening that they're literally paralyzed, right? And that's the opposite impact of what, back to where I started, like speaking truth to power, talking about your reality, constructing meaning together. Like you can't do that if you've been so destroyed by this content you're watching. So I think helping kids understand, like, we want to be active, we want to be engaged in the world. How, do we need to watch 7 videos? Can we watch 1? Do some people do better with reading things instead of watching it, right? And how do you figure that out for yourself? I think that's a really important component of this too.
Yeah, I think there's, I have so many takeaways from that. But, I think, I forget who told me, where I heard this. There's a pretty good chance it came from you. So tell me if it did. But, there was something internally at, Facebook, Meta, whatever it is, where they found that the closer a post was to violating their content moderation policies, the more engagement it got, right?
That's
so
right.
Like the closer you get to the line, the more likely you are to be seen. And again, I don't think, to your point about, especially those last two ones, I don't think young people fully understand, or many of them don't hear enough about how the system is rigged like that.
Right.
I think they just think that is the way the world is.
That's
and
right.
sort of helping them get a better sense of that.
Yeah.
The other thing that I really took away from what you said, which is something that I really try to preach in our work, is be relevant to young people. Because if you're not relevant, you've lost them, and you've lost any shot at cultivating positive change.
Yeah.
And so the example that I give that, you and I have talked about in the past is there are a ton of lessons out there from phenomenal organizations about, helping students understand anti-Semitic popular content. And the content is filled with 1920s political cartoons and Nazi propaganda of, caricature Jews with giant noses.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying we shouldn't teach about that, because it's important to understand how we got here.
Absolutely.
But kids aren't seeing that.
No.
That's not what's on their social medias right now. I saw a post on my own feed this was probably 6 or 8 months ago, of it was in the sort of mini pivotal moment where AI was generating famous people doing ridiculous things.
Oh, yeah.
And there was this post where it was the Super Bowl coin toss, and they tossed the coin up in the air, and out of nowhere, someone very obviously dressed in Hasidic Orthodox Jewish clothing comes in and snatches the coin and runs off the field. And that is what students are seeing today. And so if you're presenting them with the 1920s political caricature, I think not only is it not relevant, there's almost the risk that it perpetuates more harm, because then they say, well, that's not what I'm seeing. So what I'm seeing can't be harmful, right? What I'm seeing is just humor, right?
Yeah.
What I'm seeing is just mean funny.
Yeah.
It's not dangerous. It's not something to be concerned about, because what they're telling me I should be concerned about is this other thing. So the be relevant is, I think, unbelievably important.
I totally agree. The only other thing I would add to that is the idea of the context, right? So most of these kids are, they'll sit through those lessons, right? And they're in a classroom, and they're all using their rational brains, and they know what we want them to say, right? We want them to say don't say this, or that was mean, And so they're just tossing out the answers they know all the adults want. What we have to keep in mind is that for most kids, they're experiencing these things at night, on the weekends. They're often by themselves in their room. They might be tired. They might, you know what I mean? Those kinds of things. And so you do leave that rational lesson you learned, let's say in November, and this is now, April, and this is happening to you. You're not going to sit in your bed and be like, now time out. In that lesson they told me, they said I should say blah, 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 right? And so I think the other piece of it, in addition to being relevant, is that we have to talk about this often and in a variety of contexts, right? So that it stays front of mind, because when they're in there, what we would call hot cognition, in the moment when they're on the receiving end, their brain's firing, they're emotional, right? And they don't know what to do. The more they've, heard these kinds of things, something's going to kick in, right? Versus we heard this one lesson once, it was in the classroom, I'm done with that. It wasn't really relevant to my life.
Yep.
So what I notice kids really want to do is sit with, okay, so say this happened, right? A scenario. And it does, I think a lot of schools will say, well, I don't have the perfect scenario for this. You don't need one. They already know, right? So just saying someone says something really hurtful in the group chat, or someone uses a slur. What do you do? Right? You don't have to give them a specific example. They all know, right? And having them play through, what could you do in this scenario? What if it's your close friend? How do you handle it if it's a close friend? What do you do if it's someone that you're kind of interested in romantically? Right? Playing through a variety of different scenarios for them, that gets their attention because it does feel relevant. And then hopefully, because you've played it through in those scenarios, when they're in that moment of the emotional response, they've actually kind of thought it through, and they have a little bit more of the, whatever tools that we'd like them to use.
Yeah, that sort of quantity over quality in some ways is
totally.
The impact is just so much bigger than your one assembly a year where you talk about why this is hate speech is bad, and now we're good. And I think the last thing I want to pull out of that before I move on to sort of our final question is I'm really fascinated by this idea of kids know what we want to hear, right? And this is, to me, in all of my interactions with young people around some of these topics, this is the hardest to me, one of the hardest challenges is they know what the problem is, right?
Yes.
They're not dumb, right? And I think, again, we don't give them enough credit for it. They know that all of this is wrong. They know that there's something not right with this. And again, so they're not interested in hearing the idea that hate speech is bad as though it was a novel thing, right? They know all of this. And so to pose the $1 trillion question to you in this tiny podcast room in Boston, what do we do about that, right? How do we pierce that veil?
It's so hard. I agree with you. That is the thing, right? Because they do know the right thing. And and the one that I find really interesting at the kid level is kids who will share hate speech in a group chat and say, this one's so bad. Right? Because that is sort of, to me, emblematic of it, right? You have named, this is wrong, and yet you're sharing it anyways, right? That feels, all problematic, but the difference of somebody who sends something and they genuinely think it, or they're, they don't understand what they're sending, whatever. The person who says this one's so bad, to me, is really interesting. And that's more often than I think adults would like to believe that hate speech gets shared in that context. So I agree. It is the huge problem. I think one of the things that's coming, and this is bigger than us, but is sort of trickling down to kids, is the whole system of the way that people make money or, become famous, whatever you want to call it, on social media is through going viral. Right. And at the end of the day, what goes viral is, as you said, when you were talking about the, almost violating Facebook's, policies, what tends to go viral are the things that are shocking. And so the system is fundamentally set up to show us the most shocking things. Now, that could be shocking in an awesome way. It could provoke us to get involved and get engaged, but it also could be just me at 10 o'clock at night being shocked into thinking these things are normal, right? And so I think there's something at the platform level or the policy level where I'd love to see that incentive market shift, right? So that people could be, I don't know, however you could incentivize them that doesn't involve, just going viral. But I think it's what kids see in influencer culture is viral clout. You go viral and then you have clout. And the same thing is true in their peer group. Right. That's what they're mimicking is this. So it's yep, you want me to say that's so offensive. But what I know gives me clout in the group is being the one who's going to go right to that edge because that's what I'm seeing. And so part of it is bigger than the kids. We have to. But I think to your point of the kids are really smart. I think naming that to them and saying to them, this is what you're seeing. Let's look at a couple of these people. Why are they famous? They're famous because they've done this, right? There's a fascinating piece that Kevin Roose did on PewDiePie. And PewDiePie is a gamer. He's, to make everyone feel bad, I think he's 35 and he's retired because he made so much money gaming. Right? Well, yes, exactly. I picked the wrong career.
No, we all did, apparently.
But yes, this is probably maybe 2022, it's somewhat of a dated piece, but I really love it because PewDiePie was famous for so long. So my college students, they all watch PewDiePie in, their middle school years. He does those, he sits on his couch and he plays video games and you watch him play, right? It's the thing that every adult says to me, why are they watching other people play, right? It makes sense, but that's a story for another time. But PewDiePie, was playing Minecraft. The game targeted most directly at very young people, right? And PewDiePie would play his game, right? 5, 6. You could watch it for an hour and be like, okay, this guy's just, maybe it's juvenile humor, but nothing bad, right? And then PewDiePie will be on the exact same couch playing the exact same game, and behind him will be a swastika, right? And he doesn't talk about it, right? This is what's interesting. He doesn't mention it. He does, and he's still just playing the game. Right. And what I appreciated in this piece that Kevin Roose, so PewDiePie doesn't do a lot of interviews. And so he did talk to Kevin Roose, which is why this piece is really interesting. It was in the New York Times Magazine. But he talked about basically the incentive structure and how he was actually incentivized. Not directly. Nobody at YouTube said, hey, do this. But he made a lot more money when he did it. Now, what's really interesting to talk about with high school kids and college kids is like, okay, that's also him passing the blame, right? And everybody's passing the blame. YouTube's blaming him.
Yep.
He's blaming YouTube. He's also blaming viewers, saying if you didn't watch this,
you don't have to watch
exactly,
it. Turn it up.
right? So there's all sorts of passing of the blame. It's that Spider-Man meme, but it's really interesting because he really lays out, because he was kind of one of the first to do this. He lays out how this whole thing is structured to incentivize shock, and particularly around identity-based hate speech.
Yep. So really what I did earlier when I said it was $1 trillion problem is I vastly underestimated
it's like exactly.
Go look up the market capitalization of YouTube, Meta, Instagram,
TikTok,
all of them put together. That's the size of the problem. Right. So the last thing I'm going to ask you about, because I know we're going to have a number of people watching that are parents and families of young people.
Yeah.
And I know so much of what we've talked about is relevant to them.
Yep.
But is there anything advice that you want to give directly to them? Because I know they are craving, like, what the heck can I do? Yeah.
I think we have, as parents and guardians, for good reason, we have focused on the amount of time kids are on in front of a screen. And we should. Even the research that I think shows the incredibly positive aspects of social media never lands with, thus use it for 10 hours a day, right? So quantity does matter. But what we haven't done enough of discussions in homes and amongst families is talk about who they're watching. And I think parents should be having that conversation with kids. Who are you watching? Who are your friends paying attention to? Like, what content creators are out there, right? And you don't have to know these people already, but like, let's use PewDiePie as an example. If your kid were to say, let's say we go back to 2015 and your kid says, oh, PewDiePie, right? If you just Googled PewDiePie, you would find out what I just shared with you, right? You do not have to watch 20 hours of PewDiePie content to know that. And so paying attention to and asking them who they're watching and who they're paying attention to, and then doing a little bit of our own research would go very far, because you will find out quite quickly what these people are trafficking in. And then that's really interesting because of course, if it's something like that, you'd want to be having a conversation with your kids. But it's also helpful just as an inroad. You can say then like, hey, I watched some of that content. Like, I get why you like it. I get what's interesting here. Like, this one piece that kind of made me worried was X, right? And you can start to get into those kinds of conversations, which I think are really great. The other piece I think, and I mentioned this, but I think is worth really focusing on, it goes back to the group chat, is the thing about, we tend to, around hate speech, and I totally understand it's so much easier to believe it's just awful trolls on the internet. I think we do have to recognize that so much of this is peer-to-peer. And we have to be talking to kids about that. We have to be assuming that our kids have experienced it in a group chat, been on the receiving end. We also, quite frankly, might have to assume our kid might have done it. And we need to be talking to them about both, right? How do you make amends, right? How do you come back from it if you've done this? And also, what do you do if you're targeted? What do you do if you're seeing it, if you're a bystander in it, right? Helping them come up with strategies, whether that's coming to you, another trusted adult, right? But what I worry about so much is kids are experiencing this on their own, right? Whether it's the kid watching PewDiePie that's like, what is he doing? That's sort of weird. I won't say anything about it. Or the kid who's in the group chat that's like, I can't take this on. I don't know who's going to help me, so I'm not going to say anything. Most kids, when they tell me one-on-one in an interview that they've experienced this, I ask the question, who have you told? And most kids say no one, right? And I think they just don't know. And so having conversations with them about like, this topic, letting them know that you can be a sounding board for them. And that, yes, it might be deeply upsetting to you and, you'll have to work to regulate your own emotions with it. But, that you're actually open to having these conversations with them. You want them to come to you. And if they feel like they can't, who's your person, whether it's at school, in the, family, in our community, who can you talk to about this? I think opening that up for kids would be really helpful.
Yeah. I think, back to some of what we talked about earlier, like, obviously for worse, like it or not, this is the new normal. And for us as adults, it is a 5-alarm fire that it is the new normal. But if we approach it with our kids every single time as a 5-alarm fire, we're just not going to get anywhere because of that disconnect. So I really appreciate that. Jill, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I could have you back a million different times about a million different things and probably will. So thank you so much again. And we look forward to hearing more from you.
Of course. I'm so happy you're taking this conversation on. I think it's so important. So I really appreciate being here.
All right. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.